This is part number 45, preparation for NSE4 exam, Fortinet. Firmware and hardware. For on the FortiGate BIOS, administrators can run same operations over the flash memory and firmware images. To access the BIOS menu, you must reboot the device while connected to the console port. The booting process at one point shows the following message: press any key to display configuration mode. While this prompt is displayed, press any key to interrupt the booting process and display the BIOS menu. Options on the BIOS menu depend on version of the BIOS. BIOS is basic input-output system. It is used to start the device after it's powered on. So we see the message, press any key, and then when we press, we see BIOS menu with the following options. For example, press C to configure TFTP parameters, C for configuration, R to review TFTP parameters, T to initiate TFTP firmware transfer, T for transfer, F for format boot device, I for system information, B for boot with backup firmware and set as default, Q to quit menu and continue to boot, H to display this list of options. So after reformatting the flash memory, we must install the firmware image from the BIOS menu. Firmware installation from the console is following by these 4 steps. First step is run a TFTP server and make sure that TFTP server application is installed on your PC, personal computer. Step 2. Configure the TFTP server with the folder where the firmware image file is stored. Configure the TFTP server directory and copy the FortiGate firmware image out. Step 3. Connect the personal computer Ethernet port, NIC, to the FortiGate TFTP installation interface. Step 4. Select Get Firmware Image from the BIOS menu. The interface assigned as the TFTP installation interface depends on the model. However, in most cases, it's either port 1 or internal interface. Format flash memory. F for format. So from BIOS menu, select key F to format the flash memory. All data will be erased. So to continue, choose yes or no. Doing this might require if the firmware gets corrupted, or if the administrator wants to do a clean installation of the new firmware. Keep in mind, though, that formatting the flash memory deletes any information stored on it, such as firmware images, configurations, and digital certificates. C. Configure TFTP parameters. From BIOS menu, select C to configure TFTP parameters. Use the menu options to configure parameters such as local IP address, subnet mask, gateway address, and firmware file name. R. FortiGate and TFTP configuration settings. You can press R to review TFTP configuration settings. After you have configured the TFTP parameters, press Q to return to the main configuration menu. Here you can see image download port, DHCP status, local VLAN ID, virtual local area network ID, local IP address, local gateway, TFTP server IP address, and firmware file name. T for transfer. BIOS firmware transfer. From the BIOS menu, press T to initiate TFTP firmware transfer. The BIOS requires you to enter the IP address of the TFTP server. The FortiGate IP address must be in the same class C subnet as the TFTP server. The name of the firmware image. If everything is okay, you should see a series of pound signs indicating that the device is downloading the image. The BIOS will then verify the integrity of the file and give you the list of 3 following options. These 3 options are: Option 1. Save it as default firmware. Option 2. Save it as the backup firmware. Option 3. Run the image without saving it. If firmware is going to be used in production, then choose the first option. Save it as a default firmware. The last option, run the image without saving it, allows you to run and test firmware without overwriting any existing firmware and memory. And after finishing the test, when we are ready to roll back the change, we must reboot the device and the previously existing firmware will be used. Caution: transferring a firmware image deletes the configuration and installs the factory default configuration. Thank you.